Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today, we're not just dipping our toes, we're plunging into one of the most influential and sometimes fiercely debated books in modern biology, Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. This is a work that really reshaped how many of us think about life, evolution, and even ourselves.
Oh, absolutely. It's been described as a manual and manifesto, one that grips like a thriller, and honestly, it kind of does. Dawkins himself said he hoped to astonish people with the truth of it. I think he definitely succeeded there.
He really did. And our mission today is, well, it's all about detailed summarization. We want to give you a thorough walkthrough of its core ideas, help you navigate these pretty profound arguments.
That's the plan. We're going to distill that central message, look at the surprising implications,
Yeah.
and show how what might seem like really dense science can actually be, well, astonishingly relevant to how you see the world.
Exactly. We'll be extracting those essential insights, making sure you grasp the nuances without getting lost in, too much jargon.
Right. We're focusing on a detailed summarization of the key concepts. Everything from the origin of life right up to complex social stuff. So yeah, get ready to maybe rethink some fundamental assumptions.
Okay, let's kick off with that revolutionary premise. The one that shocked so many, apparently even Dawkins himself at first. He writes, and this quote is just amazing, "We are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes."
Wow. Yeah.
What a statement. He actually intended the book to be read almost as though it were science fiction, but he stressed, this is science. Truth stranger than fiction.
It's a huge reorientation, really. It's not just a catchy phrase. It's a fundamental shift. It moves the focus of evolution away from the individual organism, or even the species, and puts it squarely on the gene itself.
And why is that distinction so crucial, for understanding his whole argument?
Well, because it suggests that what looks like behavior for the good of an individual, or maybe a group, might actually be, underneath it all, a strategy for the survival of the genes inside those individuals. It really challenges our intuitive sense of, individual purpose or free will. It pushes us to see things from the gene's point of view.
And it's not just the science, is it? It's how he presented it. He wanted to popularize these subtle and complicated ideas in non-mathematical language, crucially, without losing their essence.
Exactly. And that approach makes it such a compelling read. Like you said, it grips you even when he's explaining something pretty abstract, like, what's the actual unit of natural selection?
So to really get this, we need to nail down what he means by selfish and altruistic, because it's not how we normally use those words, is it?
Not at all. These aren't psychological terms here. They're strictly behavioral. We're not interested in what an animal is thinking or feeling. The definition is all about the effect of an action. Does an act apparently lower the survival prospects of the one doing it, the altruist, while raising the prospects of the one receiving it, the beneficiary? Or vice versa for selfishness.
So it's all about the outcome, the observable effect on survival chances, not the intention.
Precisely. An act that looks altruistic might, when you dig deeper, actually be selfishness in disguise because of its real impact on gene survival. It strips away all the human emotional overlay from the scientific analysis.
Okay, let's get into some examples. They really bring it to life. What about selfish behaviors?
Well, the book has some vivid ones. Take black-headed gulls. They nest in big colonies, really close together. When the chicks hatch, they're tiny, helpless. It's apparently quite common for a gull to just wait until its neighbor pops off the nest. Then nip over, grab one of the neighbor's chicks, and swallow it whole.
Yikes.
Yeah. It's a quick, nutritious meal, and the gull doesn't even have to leave its own nest unprotected to go fishing. Direct benefit.
Okay, that's pretty clear-cut selfishness. What else?
Well, there's the rather macabre case of female praying mantises. Often during or after mating, the female just eats the male, sometimes starting with his head. Sometimes, yeah. It gives her a substantial meal, obviously.
Yeah.
And there's even a suggestion that losing his head might actually improve the male's sexual performance, weirdly enough. Increases the chance of fertilization.
Nature is wild. Okay, so those are pretty stark examples of benefiting oneself. What about the other side, the apparently altruistic stuff?
Right, things that look like self-sacrifice. The classic example is worker bees stinging intruders. When a bee stings to defend the hive's honey stores, it's basically a kamikaze mission. Its stinger gets ripped out, taking vital organs with it, and the bee dies shortly after.
So the individual dies, but the colony, and therefore the queen's genes, potentially survive.
Exactly. The individual worker doesn't benefit, obviously. Another one is small birds giving alarm calls. When one spots a hawk, it calls out, and the whole flock dives for cover. Now, there's evidence suggesting the bird that makes the call might actually draw the predator's attention to itself. It's taking a slight additional risk, as Dawkins puts it.
Okay, so it looks altruistic on the surface. So the big question then, if these acts look selfless, how does Dawkins argue they're ultimately driven by gene selfishness?
Well, that leads us straight to the core of his argument. It all hinges on identifying the fundamental unit of natural selection.
Right. Because for ages, biologists argued about this, didn't they? Is evolution acting on individuals, groups, whole species?
Precisely. And Dawkins lands firmly on the gene. He takes Darwin's survival of the fittest, but applies it right down at the gene level. He discusses group selection, this idea pushed by people like Robert Ardrey that individuals might sacrifice themselves for the good of the group, and he contrasts it with individual selection. But his main point, his whole thesis really, is gene selection.
And he wasn't keen on group selection. Why not?
It's problematic from his viewpoint because, well, think about it. If you have a group of mostly altruists who sacrifice themselves, what stops one selfish individual from exploiting all that altruism? That selfish individual would presumably leave more offspring, and the selfish trait would spread, undermining the group altruism.
Ah, okay. The system is vulnerable to cheaters.
Exactly. So Dawkins' central argument, the real linchpin, is that the gene is the fundamental unit of natural selection, and therefore the fundamental unit of self-interest. That's the level where the real evolutionary game is played.
It's a major shift in thinking. He even mentions that weird gazelle behavior, stotting, where they jump really high in front of predators.
Yeah, Ardrey used that as an example, needing group selection. Dawkins basically says, hold that thought, I'll explain it later, using the selfish gene model. We'll get to Zahavi's idea on that.
Okay, so to really grasp this gene-centric view, we need to go back, way back, to the origins of life itself, Rita. How did this principle emerge from, well, nothing?
Indeed. Darwin's theory is powerful because it explains complexity from simplicity, how unordered atoms could group themselves into ever more complex patterns until they ended up manufacturing people. But Dawkins takes it even further back. He talks about survival of the fittest being just a special case of a much more general law, survival of the stable.
Survival of the stable.
Yeah. Think about the universe. It's filled with stable things, mountains, raindrops, salt crystals, galaxies. Stability is common. Even chemical reactions like fusion in the sun, creating helium from hydrogen, favor more stable configurations. Stable patterns just persist.
Okay, so stability is a fundamental property, but how does that get us to life? It's not just atoms randomly bumping together to make a person, surely.
No, definitely not. The odds against that are astronomical.
Okay.
A person has, what, 1,000 million atoms? Random chance alone won't cut it. Darwin's genius, and Dawkins builds on this, was explaining complexity cumulatively, step-by-step building. So, picture the early Earth. A primeval soup, this sort of thickening broth of water, chemicals, energy from sunlight, lightning. In this soup, large organic molecules could form. And some of these, by chance, developed the ability to make copies of themselves. He calls these the replicators.
The first self-copying molecule?
Exactly. And crucially, back then, there were no bacteria or anything to break them down, so they could just drift around, absorbing energy, making more copies.
Okay, so they had free reign for a while, but that couldn't last forever, could it?
No. Resources are always finite. Building blocks, energy. So, inevitably, competition arose. Different varieties of replicators would have emerged due to copying errors, mutations, and any copying error that made a replicator more stable or better at copying itself, or crucially, worse for its rivals.
Ah, like actively harming competitors.
Yeah, maybe some replicators discovered how to chemically break down rival molecules and use their parts, the first proto-carnivores, you could say. Others might have developed protective barriers, chemical walls, the precursors to the first living cells.
So the replicators that survived were the ones that built better protection, better ways to compete.
Precisely. They built survival machines for themselves. Starting simple, maybe just a protein code. But as competition intensified over millions of years, these machines got bigger, more complex, more elaborate. It was a continuous escalating process.
And these survival machines are us, all living things.
That's the idea. We, meaning all life animals, plants, bacteria, viruses, are these survival machines, built by and for the replicators, the genes.
Which brings us to DNA. Because no matter how different life forms look, there's this underlying unity, isn't there?
Absolutely. Octopuses, oak trees, us, incredibly different on the outside. But the fundamental chemistry, and especially the replicators they carry, the DNA, it's basically the same kind of molecule in all of us. As Dawkins puts it, A monkey is a machine that preserves genes up trees. A fish is a machine that preserves genes in the water.
And our DNA is packed inside our cells, like every single cell.
Pretty much every cell, yeah. A human body has trillions of cells, and almost everyone contains a complete copy of that body's unique DNA blueprint. He uses the analogy of the DNA as a set of architect's plans stored in a bookcase, the nucleus, spread across 46 volumes, our chromosomes.
Incredible. So this DNA, these genes, they control how we develop from that first cell.
They do. And the evolutionary significance of this is huge. Genes control development, which means they are, at least partly, responsible for their own future survival. Their fate depends on how well they build the survival machine, the body.
And this is different from the old idea, Lamarckism, where you could pass on traits acquired during your lifetime.
Right. Dawkins stresses that evolution doesn't work that way. Each new generation starts genetically fresh. Your body is just the genes' way of keeping themselves intact and getting copied. Natural selection favors genes that are good at building survival machines. But the genes themselves have no foresight, no purpose. They just are. Some are simply better at surviving and replicating than others.
But it's not just one gene building a body, is it? He calls modern replicators highly gregarious.
Yes, that's crucial. A complex organism like us is built by thousands, tens of thousands of genes working together. Building a body is an incredibly intricate cooperative venture. It's almost impossible to isolate the effect of just one gene. One gene can influence many different parts of the body, and one body part is usually influenced by lots of genes. Their effects are all tangled up. Some genes even act like master switches, controlling whole sets of other genes.
Okay, but if they cooperate so much, why call them selfish? That seems like a contradiction.
Ah, that's the million-dollar question. And the answer, or a big part of it, lies in sex, sexual reproduction.
How does sex make cooperating genes selfish?
Well, think about it. With sex, you don't just make identical copies, you mix and shuffle genes from two parents. This means an individual body is just a temporary vehicle holding a unique, short-lived combination of genes. That specific combination will likely never exist again.
Okay, so my unique mix of genes dies with me.
Your combination does, yes. But the individual genes themselves, they are potentially very long-lived. They can be passed down, reshuffled into new combinations, generation after generation. They constantly cross and recross down the generations. A particular gene might exist in countless different bodies over millennia.
So our 46 chromosomes, those volumes of plans, are really 23 pairs, one set from mom, one from dad.
Exactly. And for many traits, there are corresponding genes, alleles, on each chromosome in a pair. Like you might get a brown eye gene from one parent and a blue eye gene from the other.
And one might be dominant, like brown over blue?
Right. The dominant gene's instruction gets expressed, but the recessive blue eye gene is still there, potentially passed on to the next generation. So genes get doled out at conception, mixed into these temporary combinations. The gene pool is the technical term for all the genes available in a population constantly being stirred up by sex, and another process called crossing over.
Crossing over. That's not just shuffling whole chromosomes, is it? It's more detailed than that.
Much more detailed. When sperm and eggs are formed, chunks of corresponding chromosomes from the pair actually swap pieces. Imagine taking pages or even paragraphs from volume 1A and swapping them with the equivalent bits from volume 1B.
So every single sperm or egg is genetically unique.
Pretty much, yeah, even from the same individual.
Hmm.
This crossing over means genes aren't really like neat separate pages. They're more like segments on a long tape. And the breaks for crossing over can happen within what we technically call a cistron, the bit of DNA coding for one protein.
So how do we actually define a gene for this evolutionary purpose there, if it's not always a neat package?
Good question. While a cistron is a functional unit, Dawkins defines the evolutionary gene as basically the smallest chunk of chromosome that is likely to last long enough, survive through enough generations of crossing over to potentially be selected for or against. It's defined by its potential longevity, its ability to be faithfully copied, and its capacity to make lots of copies, fecundity. It's the unit that persists. Its near immortality is what makes it the fundamental unit.
And that leads directly back to selfishness.
Yes, because at the gene level, altruism must be bad and selfishness good. Why? Because genes are competing primarily with their alleles, the alternative versions of themselves, vying for the same spot on the chromosome. Any gene that behaves in such a way that it increases its own survival chances in the gene pool at the expense of its alleles will, by definition, tend to survive and become more common.
So the gene is the ultimate unit of self-interest.
The gene is the basic unit of selfishness. That's the core message.
But what about that cooperation, the genes building the body together? How does that fit with them being selfish? He uses an analogy, right? Oarsmen in a boat.
Yeah, it's a great analogy to resolve that apparent paradox. Imagine genes as oarsmen in a racing boat, the body. They all need to cooperate to make the boat go fast and win, survive and reproduce. If the boat sinks, they all die. So good genes can be lost if they happen to be in a body with a really bad lethal gene.
Okay, so cooperation is necessary for the vehicle's success.
Yes. But the oarsmen are also competing with rival oarsmen, alleles, for spots in future boats. Replicas of a good gene exist in many different boats. So selection favors genes that are not only good at their specific job, rowing well, but also good at cooperating with the other genes they're likely to share a boat with. Teamwork, compatibility, these become selfishly advantageous traits for a gene because they help build successful vehicles.
So they need to work well within the climate of other genes in the gene pool.
Exactly. A gene is selected for its ability to thrive in the environment provided by all the other genes in the pool. This leads to the evolution of stable sets of cooperating genes.
Which brings us back to the core idea. Selection acts at the gene level, even
Right.
though we see organisms, the phenotypes, interacting with the world.
Precisely. The phenotype is what selection sees, but it's the underlying genes that are ultimately playing the long game.
Okay, so if genes are fundamentally selfish players, how does this framework explain something like animal aggression? Which, as you mentioned, often seems quite restrained, not always fatal.
Yeah, people like Conrad Lorenz pointed out that animal fights are often more like formal tournaments, with rules, displays, and gestures of surrender. Not always fights to the death. It looks almost polite sometimes.
Like a gloved fist, as Lorenz put it, looks superficially altruistic, maybe for the good of the species, avoiding serious injury.
Right, but the selfish gene perspective, particularly using John Maynard Smith's concept of the evolutionarily stable strategy, ESS, provides a powerful explanation that doesn't rely on group benefit.
ESS. Okay, let's unpack that. What is an ESS?
An ESS isn't a conscious strategy, it's a pre-programmed behavioral policy, like a rule an animal follows. The key thing is, an ESS is a strategy that, if most members of a population adopt it, cannot be bettered by any other alternative strategy. Any individual trying something different won't do as well, on average.
So it's stable against invasion by mutants playing a different strategy.
Exactly. It explains why, even in a world of selfish genes, we don't necessarily see constant all-out warfare. Restraint can actually be the most selfishly advantageous strategy in the long run.
And the classic model for this is the hawk versus dove game, isn't it?
It is. It's a simplified model, but really illustrative. Imagine two possible strategies in a population. Hawk. Always fights hard. Escalates immediately. Only retreats if seriously injured. Dove. Displays, threatens, but never actually hurts anyone. Retreats if the opponent escalates.
Okay, hawk is aggressive, dove is pacifist.
Pretty much. Now, we assign arbitrary points for outcomes like, say, plus 50 for winning a fight, 0 for retreating, a negative 100 for being seriously injured, and maybe negative 10 for wasting time in a long display. These points represent fitness, gene survival.
Right. So what happens?
Well, imagine a population made up entirely of doves. When two doves meet, they posture for a bit, and one eventually retreats. No one gets hurt. They share the wins and losses of time wasting. Let's say the average payoff is plus 15 points. That seems pretty good, right?
Peaceful, everyone benefits moderately.
Okay, sounds stable. But what if a hawk appears? A mutant? Ah, now it gets interesting. A single hawk in a population of doves is ecstatic. Every contest it enters, it fights a dove. The dove immediately retreats. The hawk wins plus 50 points every single time, suffering no costs.
So hawk genes would spread like wildfire.
Absolutely. Hawks would rapidly take over. But what happens when the population is mostly hawks? Now, hawks mostly fight other hawks. These are brutal contests. On average, a hawk wins half the time, plus 50, and gets seriously injured half the time, max 100. The average payoff for a hawk in an all-hawk population plunges to negative 25 points.
Ouch. Much worse than the doves were doing.
Much worse. Now imagine a single dove mutant appears in this population of hawks. When this dove meets a hawk, it immediately retreats, getting 0 points.
0 is way better than minus 25.
Exactly. So dove genes would start to spread again in the hawk population.
So neither all dove nor all hawk is stable. It's going to settle somewhere in between.
That's the crucial insight of ESS. The system reaches a stable equilibrium. In this specific and very simplified model, the stable state, the ESS, turns out to be a mixed population with a certain ratio. Maynard Smith calculated it as 712 hawks and 512 doves. At this ratio, the average payoff for being a hawk is exactly the same as the average payoff for being a dove, around 6.25 points in this example.
Yeah.
Neither strategy can successfully invade the other.
And crucially, this is not group selection, right? Because the all-dove population had a higher average payoff, plus 15.
Absolutely critical point. The ESS is not necessarily the best outcome for the group as a whole. An all-dove group would be nicer for everyone involved. But, as Dawkins says, such a conspiracy of doves is vulnerable. It's open to abuse by any single hawk who would do extremely well initially. And ESS is stable because it's immune to treachery from within, not because it's optimal for the group. It's stable because no individual can improve its own payoff by unilaterally changing its strategy.
So in reality, this could mean either a mix of individuals genetically programmed to be hawks or doves, or individuals who play hawk or dove randomly with the correct probabilities.
Both are possibilities. The key is that the behavior should be unpredictable to rivals. If you always played hawk 7 times, then dove 5 times, others would exploit that pattern. And of course, real life is more complex. There are other strategies, like retaliator act like a dove but hit back hard if attacked, or bully act like a hawk until someone hits back, then run away. These more complex models get closer to observed animal behavior.
What about contests that aren't about fighting, but just waiting?
The war of attrition. Yeah, that's another ESS model. Here, there's no dangerous fighting, just posturing or waiting. The winner is the one willing to persist longer. Time becomes the resource being spent. The ESS involves choosing a random, unpredictable waiting time based on the value of the resource, preventing opponents from guessing how long you'll stick around.
And these symmetries matter too, right? Like who owns the territory?
Big time. Simple rules like, if you're the resident, attack. If you're the intruder, retreat can be an ESS. It avoids costly fights. The asymmetry, resident versus intruder, provides a conventional cue to settle the dispute, even if the resident isn't actually stronger. The resident often does have advantages, like knowing the terrain, but the convention itself can be stable. The opposite rule, intruder attacks, resident retreats, wouldn't be stable. It would lead to constant, pointless shuffling.
And size or strength differences.
Another key asymmetry, if opponent is larger, retreat is an obvious, sensible strategy. These asymmetries often lead to stable dominance hierarchies.
No, hierarchies aren't necessarily for the good of the group either.
Not primarily. They emerge from individual interactions and learning based on these ESS principles, especially when animals recognize each other and remember past encounters. Hens sorting out their pecking order reduces overall conflict, which might benefit the group incidentally, but it arises from individuals learning their place based on selfish calculations of risk and reward.
You also mentioned the difference between fighting within a species versus between species.
Right. Intraspecific conflict within a species is usually more direct competition for the same resources: mates, territories, food. Interspecific conflict between species is often more like predator-prey or competition for different resources. A lion wants to eat the antelope, they aren't competing for mates. Cannibalism, fighting your own species, carries a higher risk of dangerous retaliation compared to hunting prey, which tends to flee.
So this ESS concept seems really broad. Dawkins thinks it's a major advance.
He calls it one of the most important advances in evolutionary theory since Darwin, because it applies anywhere there's a conflict of interest, which is almost everywhere in biology. It helps explain how collections of independent, selfish entities, genes, or individuals driven by genes, can end up looking like an organized whole. Think social structures, ecosystems. It's a powerful tool for understanding stability that arises from selfish interactions.
And it links back to that idea of gene compatibility, too, the oarsmen needing to work together.
Exactly. Genes are selected in the context of the other genes they're likely to encounter in the gene pool. A gene for sharp, tearing teeth is great in a carnivore gene pool, but disastrous in a herbivore one. Selection favors good mixers, genes that work well with the prevailing genetic climate. It looks like selection for cooperation, but it stems from the selfish advantage of being compatible with your likely genetic partners in building a successful survival machine.
Okay, so aggression is strategic, driven by selfish calculations modeled by ESS. What about the flip side, cooperation, especially within families?
Right. If every gene is fundamentally selfish, how do we explain parents caring for their young or siblings helping each other? Does the selfish gene idea hold up?
Yeah, is it still just about the gene?
According to Dawkins, yes. The key insight here, building heavily on the work of W.D. Hamilton, is kin selection. Remember, a gene exists as multiple copies distributed across different individuals. A gene in your body might be able to help replicas of itself that reside in the bodies of your relatives.
Because relatives share genes.
Exactly. If an act of apparent altruism, say sacrificing yourself, saves enough close relatives who likely carry copies of the same altruism gene, then the gene itself increases in frequency in the gene pool, even though one particular body carrying it died.
So, individual altruism can be caused by underlying gene selfishness.
That's the core idea. Dawkins illustrates it with a hypothetical green beard gene. Imagine a gene that causes two things. Gives its owner a visible label, like a green beard, and he makes the owner behave altruistically towards other green-bearded individuals.
So the gene can recognize copies of itself in others.
Theoretically, yes. The gene helps copies of itself, ensuring its own propagation. While clear-cut greenbeards are probably rare, the principle is important.
And the most plausible way genes recognize copies isn't greenbeards, but simply kinship.
Precisely. That's Hamilton's breakthrough. Close relatives have a statistically higher than average chance of sharing any particular gene. Your parents, children, and full siblings share, on average, 50% of your genes. Grandparents, grandchildren, aunts, uncles, nephews, nieces share 25%. First cousins share 12.5%,
Yep.
or 18, and so on.
So there's a quantifiable degree of relatedness.
Yes, you can calculate the coefficient of relatedness. This allows a gene to calculate, metaphorically speaking, of course, the likely benefit of an altruistic act. Haldane famously quipped he'd lay down his life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins, reflecting this maths. Saving 2 brothers, each 50% related, or 8 cousins, each 18 related, statistically saves 1 full copy of your genome's worth of genes.
And this kin selection is not the same as group selection.
Emphatically not, as Dawkins stresses. It's a direct consequence of gene selection. It's about a gene favoring copies of itself, which just happen to reside in relatives. There's no sharp line between family and non-family. It's a gradient of probability. We expect altruism to decrease quantitatively as relatedness decreases.
And these calculations aren't just about relatedness, but also about future potential.
Right. They also weigh in factors like reproductive value or life expectancy. An older relative might be less valuable to save, genetically speaking, than a younger one with more reproductive years ahead. It's like a gene acting as a ruthless life insurance underwriter, investing altruism where it gets the best genetic return.
But animals aren't actually doing these sums in their heads.
Of course not. The idea is that natural selection has favored genes that predispose individuals to behave as if they were making these calculations. The behaviors are driven by rules of thumb, honed by evolution based on the average statistical likelihoods of kinship and benefit in past environments.
And sometimes these rules of thumb can go wrong, lead to misfirings.
Definitely. Uncertainty about kinship is common. Is that male really the father? Are these siblings full or half? In species that don't move much, the average relatedness within the local group might be high enough that a simple rule like be nice to anyone you meet regularly works well enough on average, even if you occasionally help a non-relative. This might explain seemingly indiscriminate altruism in some stable social groups.
Like whales helping unrelated drowning individuals. Or that dolphin saving a human swimmer story.
Could be misfirings of generally adaptive rules, yes. But the most dramatic examples of exploiting these rules are the brood parasites, like cuckoos.
Ah, yes, the cuckoos again. They exploit the parental care instinct.
They absolutely do. Most bird parents operate on the rule, care for any small bird sitting in the nest you build. Normally, this works fine because chicks in your nest are overwhelmingly likely to be your own offspring. But the cuckoo inserts its egg, tricking the host parents into raising its young. The host parent is blindly following a rule that is usually adaptive, but is being exploited in this specific case.
And this leads to an evolutionary arms race.
It does. Hosts evolve better discrimination learning to recognize their own eggs patterns, rejecting odd ones. Cuckoos, in turn, evolve ever more sophisticated mimicry of host eggs. It's a constant battle of deception and detection, driven by the conflict between the parasite's genes and the host's genes.
It really highlights how these rules are imperfect.
Very much so. And it reinforces the idea that altruism isn't some fuzzy niceness. It's a calculated strategy, often based on kinship probabilities, that can be ruthlessly exploited.
Okay, so kinship explains a lot of cooperation. But families aren't always harmonious, are they? What about conflicts within the family?
Yes, the battle of the generations and the battle of the sexes. Even with shared genes, conflicts of interest are everywhere. Let's start with parents and offspring.
The battle of the generations. How does that work from a gene's perspective? We need to bring in parental investment, right? PI.
Yes. Robert Trevor's concept of parental investment is key. PI is any investment by the parent in an individual offspring that increases the offspring's chance of surviving, at the cost of the parent's ability to invest in other offspring. It's a finite resource, time, energy, food, risk measured in units of detriment to other potential offspring, current or future.
And parents have to decide how to allocate this limited PI between caring for current kids and making new ones.
Exactly. There's a trade-off between childbearing, making more, and
Mhm.
child caring, investing in existing ones. A mother, for example, has a total lifetime budget of PI. She wants to maximize the number of her genes passed on, which usually means finding an optimal balance. Spreading PI too thinly across too many offspring might mean none survive well. Lacks theory. Concentrating too much on just one or two spoiled brats might mean fewer successful descendants overall compared to having a larger, adequately cared for brood.
Does a mother play favorites genetically?
From a purely genetic standpoint, no. She's equally related 50% to all her offspring. Favoritism, if it occurs, should ideally be based on the offspring's potential return on investment. A runt, for instance, might require a huge amount of PI just to reach the same survival probability as its healthier siblings. It might actually benefit the mother's genes more to cut her losses with the runt and invest that PI in the others.
Like the mother pig eating the runt.
A harsh example, but yes. Converting the runt into milk for the others is, from a gene's perspective, potentially the optimal strategy in some circumstances. Similarly, if forced to choose, a parent should favor an older child over a younger one, simply because more PI has already been sunk into the older one. Abandoning it means a greater loss of past investment.
So there's this constant underlying tension. What about weaning? That's often a point of conflict.
Classic example of parent-offspring conflict. The mother wants to stop investing, the child, as soon as the cost of that investment, in terms of detriment to future offspring, outweighs the benefit to the current child. But the child's perspective is different. It is 100% related to itself, but only 50% related to its siblings. Full siblings, anyway. So, from the child's genetic point of view, it wants the mother to keep investing in it until the cost to siblings is more than double the benefit it receives.
So the child wants more PI than the mother is willing to give based on her overall genetic interests.
Exactly. There's a period where the mother wants to wean, but the child wants to continue suckling, leading to conflict.
And children might cheat to get more, like the baby bird screaming.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Screaming louder than you are hungry could be a way to manipulate the parent into giving you more food than your fair share. It's a form of signaling exaggeration. Of course, screaming too loud might attract predators, so there's a limit. But selection could favor genes for a certain level of dishonesty in offspring signaling.
And the runt phenomenon fits here too. Maybe the runt agrees to die.
That's a fascinating, if grim, prediction from the theory. If a runt's prospects are truly dire, such that the PI needed to save it could provide more than double the benefit if given to its siblings instead, then a gene programming the runt to essentially give up the struggle gracefully could actually be favored by selection because that gene has a 50% chance of being present in the siblings who benefit.
Wow. There was also that idea from Alexander about parents always winning this battle through parental manipulation.
Yeah, Alexander suggested parents hold all the cards and can manipulate offspring against the offspring's own best interests. He argued a gene for child selfishness would be penalized later when that individual became a parent dealing with its own selfish offspring. But Dawkins points out a flaw here. There's no real genetic asymmetry. Parents and offspring are both 50% related. Genes are selected for optimizing their effects depending on whether they find themselves in a child's body or a parent's body. The optimal strategy changes.
So who wins?
It's likely an ongoing co-evolutionary struggle. Parents are bigger and stronger, controlling resources. But children have psychological weapons, sulking, screaming, manipulating parental affection, maybe lying about how hungry or endangered they feel. It's hard for parents to detect small manipulations.
And the cuckoo chick takes manipulation to an extreme with its blackmail.
Yes, the cuckoo chick screaming extra loud. It attracts predators, which puts the foster mother's own potential future offspring at risk, since she shares the territory. The foster mother has more to lose from the predator than the cuckoo does, genetically. So it might actually pay the foster mother genetically to shut the cuckoo up by feeding it more than its share. A gene for this kind of blackmail can spread in cuckoos, even though it would be disadvantageous in a normal species.
And some cuckoos and honey guides are physically ruthless too.
Unbelievably so. Honey guide chicks hatch with sharp hooks on their beaks, specifically to kill their foster siblings in the nest. British cuckoos hatch first and instinctively push any other eggs or chicks out.
Dead brothers do not compete for food.
Stark, but that's the logic. Dawkins even speculates about baby swallows, seen ejecting magpie eggs. Maybe a misfiring anti-cuckoo defense. or perhaps even calculated fratricide to secure a larger share of parental resources. It suggests the ruthless logic of the cuckoo isn't entirely alien, it's just an extreme version of the conflicts inherent in all families.
It's incredible how the selfish gene lens illuminates these dynamics. Okay, so that's parent-offspring conflict. What about the battle of the sexes?
The conflict between mates. This is potentially even more intense because, unlike parents and offspring, mates usually aren't closely related genetically. They only share a 50% stake in their children. Each partner's genes want the other partner to invest more in raising the offspring, freeing up their own resources for other reproductive opportunities. Exploitation is inherent in the relationship.
And the root of this conflict lies in the fundamental difference between males and females.
Yes. The defining difference biologically across almost all multicellular life is gamete size. Females, by definition, produce large, nutrient-rich, relatively few eggs. Males produce small, mobile, numerous sperm. This initial asymmetry in investment per gamete sets the stage. As Dawkins puts it, the female sex is exploited, and the fundamental evolutionary basis for the exploitation is the fact that eggs are larger than sperms.
How did this difference even evolve from an ancestral state where gametes were equal?
The theory is that starting from isogamy, equal gametes, disruptive selection occurred. Two diverging strategies became successful. One was to make gametes slightly larger, providing a better start for the embryo, honest gametes eggs. The other was to make gametes smaller and more numerous, specializing in finding and fusing with the larger ones, essentially parasitizing their investment. Exploitative gametes sperms, intermediate sizes were selected against.
The honest ones became eggs, and the exploiters became sperms.
Wow.
And this asymmetry affects things like the sex ratio.
It does indirectly. You look at something like elephant seals, where maybe 4% of the males do almost 90% of the mating. It seems incredibly wasteful to produce so many bachelor males. From a simplistic good of the species view, you'd expect maybe a 100-to-1 female-to-male ratio. But the actual ratio tends towards 1.1. Why? Ari Fisher figured this out. From a parent's selfish genetic point of view, sons and daughters represent potentially equal avenues for propagating genes into future generations. If sons become rare, investing in sons becomes more profitable genetically, and vice versa. This frequency-dependent selection keeps the ratio hovering around 1.1 at the population level.
Okay, so back to exploitation. The female, having invested more initially in the large egg, is more committed from the start.
Generally, yes. She has more to lose if the offspring fails. This makes her potentially more vulnerable to desertion by the male. If she gets deserted, the father might also desert, leaving her holding the baby, literally. This often leads to females investing far more throughout development, incubation, lactation, protection, feeding.
Which opens the door for males to evolve counter-strategies to avoid investing in offspring that aren't theirs.
Exactly. Things like the Bruce effect. In mice, a new male scent causes a pregnant female to abort, eliminating potential stepchildren. Or male lions killing existing cubs when they take over a pride. These are brutal strategies favored by selection because they prevent males from investing resources in rivals' genes.
But females aren't just passive victims here. They have counterploys too, right?
Oh yes. Dawkins outlines two main female strategies to counter male exploitation or ensure good genes. One is the domestic bliss strategy. The female plays hard to get. She refuses to mate until the male has demonstrated significant commitment and investment, building a nest, prolonged courtship feeding, defending a territory.
So she forces him to invest up front.
Exactly. By the time conception occurs, the male has already sunk considerable resources, making him less likely to desert. This favors fidelity and monogamy.
And the other strategy?
The He-Man strategy. Here, the female gives up on getting the male to help raise the young. Instead, she focuses purely on picking a male with the best possible genes. She chooses based on evidence of his genetic quality, maybe his strength, bright colors, dominance, quality of his territory. She mates, gets the good genes, and raises the kids herself or with minimal male help. This often leads to polygyny, like harems, where a few top males father most offspring.
And this links to why males are often more brightly colored or ornamented than females? Sexual dimorphism.
Precisely. It's a result of conflicting selection pressures. Drab colors help avoid predators. Bright colors attract mates, but also predators. Because males, typically the less investing sex, compete more intensely for mating opportunities, the payoff for successfully attracting mates can be huge, outweighing the increased predation risk. A short-lived, flashy male who fathers many offspring passes on more genes than a long-lived, drab male who fathers few. Females, being the limiting resource, often face stronger selection for survival, to raise the young, than for extreme ornamentation. Males become the high-risk, high-reward gamblers in the evolutionary casino.
So conflict seems inherent even within species, driving so much of this behavior. But what about cooperation between individuals who aren't necessarily related, or even between different species?
Right, we see animals living in groups, symbiotic relationships. How does the selfish gene explain that? The fundamental principle remains. The association must provide a net benefit to the individual's genes, outweighing the costs, like increased competition for food or risk of disease in groups. Think of hyenas hunting in packs. They can bring down much larger prey together than alone. So even with sharing, each individual gets more food on average. Or penguins huddling for warmth, each reduces its own exposed surface area. Fish schooling might offer hydrodynamic benefits or confuse predators.
Safety in numbers seems like a big driver for group living.
It often is. And W.D. Hamilton's selfish herd model provides a great insight here. It's not about the herd cooperating consciously.
It's a herd of selfish individuals.
Exactly. The model assumes predators tend to attack the nearest prey item. So each individual prey animal constantly tries to position itself to avoid being on the edge, to put other individuals between itself and potential danger. This selfish maneuvering naturally leads to the animals bunching together, forming a herd, purely as a result of individuals trying to minimize their own domain of danger. No altruism required.
Okay, that makes sense for herds. But what about those alarm calls again? The bird warning the flock. You said kin selection could explain it, but are there purely selfish explanations too?
There are. One intriguing idea is the never break ranks theory. If a bird spots a predator and just flies off alone, it becomes conspicuous, an isolated target. Predators often single out individuals that act differently. So by giving an alarm call, the caller ensures the whole flock takes off together. It maintains the safety of the group, which includes the caller itself. It's almost like selfishly manipulating the rest of the flock to act in a way that benefits the caller's own safety.
Clever. And what about the starting gazelles, the ones jumping high? Zahavi's idea.
Right, Zahavi's handicap principle offers a fascinating, purely selfish explanation for that seemingly risky display. The gazelle isn't warning other gazelles, it's signaling directly to the predator.
Signaling what? Eat me?
Quite the opposite. It's saying, look how fit and strong I am. See how high I can jump. You'll never catch me. You'd be much better off chasing my slower neighbor over there who isn't jumping so impressively.
So it's an honest advertisement of fitness intended to deter the predator from even trying to chase that individual.
Exactly. The cost of the display, energy, temporary vulnerability, ensures its honesty. Only a genuinely fit gazelle can afford such a flamboyant, handicapping display. It's pure self-advertisement, not altruism.
Okay, moving beyond animal behavior. Dawkins introduces this totally different concept, the meme, a new kind of replicator.
Yes, this is where the book takes a really interesting turn, applying the replicator logic to human culture. He defines a meme as a unit of cultural transmission, or a unit of imitation. He argues that culture evolves in a way analogous to genetic evolution, but much, much faster. Language, fashion, tunes, ideas, technologies, they spread through populations, mutate, compete, and evolve.
He used birdsong as an example.
Yeah, Jenkins' study on saddlebacks in New Zealand showed that song patterns weren't inherited genetically, but were learned by young birds imitating their neighbors. Songs acted like replicating units, with mutations, copying errors, leading to new song types that could then spread accurately.
And this applies directly to human culture, fashions, diet, science itself.
He argues it does. Think about how ideas spread through speech, writing, art, internet. Some ideas catch on and replicate widely, others die out. He even suggests modern science is actually better than ancient science, implying a kind of progressive cultural evolution, driven by memes competing for space in human brains.
And the most famous, maybe controversial example he uses is the God meme.
It is. He analyzes the idea of God purely as a meme, a unit of information that replicates very successfully. Why? Because it has high survival value in the meme pool. It offers seemingly plausible answers to big, troubling questions about existence. It promises justice in the afterlife. It provides comfort. These features give it strong psychological appeal, making it highly likely to be copied and passed down through generations via words, music, art, etc.
And memes can work together, like genes, in complexes.
Yes, he talks about co-adapted meme complexes, or memeplexes. An organized religion, for example, isn't just the God meme. It's a whole package. Rituals, scriptures, laws, architecture, music, traditions that all reinforce each other and help the entire complex replicate effectively. He even points to things like the threat of hellfire as a particularly effective, if nasty, technique for ensuring the meme complex's survival and transmission.
Can memes and genes conflict? Like his example of celibacy.
Absolutely. A gene for celibacy would be evolutionary suicide, obviously. It wouldn't get passed on.
Hmm?
But the meme for celibacy, as part of a religious memeplex, can be very successful. Why? Because a celibate priest, for example, might have more time and energy to devote to spreading the memes of the religion compared to one raising a family. In this sense, the priest's body becomes a survival machine for the memes, even at the expense of his own genes.
That really makes you think differently about why certain ideas or beliefs persist, doesn't it? Even if they seem counterintuitive biologically.
It does. It suggests ideas themselves are engaged in a kind of Darwinian struggle for existence in the environment of human culture.
Okay, so we have kin selection explaining altruism to relatives. What about cooperation between non-relatives? This is where reciprocal altruism comes in.
Yes, another key concept, again from Robert Trivers, reciprocal altruism. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. It's cooperation based on expected reciprocation. It can evolve if individuals interact repeatedly, can recognize each other, and remember past interactions. You help someone now, expecting they'll help you later. It can work even between different species. Think of cleaner fish removing parasites from larger fish. Both benefit,
Dawkins uses the model of grudger, sucker, and cheat to illustrate this.
right? Suckers help everyone indiscriminately and get exploited by cheats who accept help but never give it. Grudgers help strangers initially and help those who have helped them before, but they refuse to help anyone who has cheated them in the past. They hold a grudge.
And what happens in a simulation?
A population of suckers is easily invaded and destroyed by cheats. But if grudgers are present, they can resist invasion by cheats. Grudgers benefit from mutual cooperation amongst themselves, and they punish cheats by refusing to help them. Eventually, grudgers can drive cheats to extinction or to a low frequency. Interestingly, both grudger and cheat can be ESS under certain conditions. A population of all cheats is stable because neither suckers nor grudgers can initially gain a foothold if grudgers are rare. It shows cooperation isn't guaranteed. It depends on the starting conditions and strategies present.
And this leads into the more formal game theory work with the prisoner's dilemma.
Exactly. Robert Axelrod, working with Hamilton, ran computer tournaments based on the iterated prisoner's dilemma. In a single game of prisoner's dilemma, the rational choice is always to defect, cheat, even though mutual cooperation would yield a better outcome for both than mutual defection. That's the dilemma.
But making it iterated, playing the game repeatedly with the same opponent, changes everything.
Completely. If you know you'll interact with someone again, it opens the door for strategies based on reciprocity, trust, forgiveness, and retaliation. You're not just trying to win this round, you're playing a longer game. Axelrod invited experts to submit computer strategies for an iterated tournament.
And the winner was surprisingly simple. Tit for tat.
Amazingly simple. Submitted by Anatol Rappaport. Tit for tat's rules. 1. Cooperate on the first move. 2. After that, just do whatever the opponent did on the previous move.
So it starts nice, but immediately punishes defection and immediately forgives if the opponent cooperates again.
Exactly. It's nice, retaliatory, forgiving, and also clear. It consistently scored at or near the top in Axelrod's tournaments against much more complex strategies.
What made it and strategies like it so successful?
Axelrod identified key properties. Successful strategies tended to be nice, never the first to defect, forgiving, doesn't hold grudges forever, willing to restore cooperation, and importantly, not envious, doesn't try to score more than the opponent, just aims for a high absolute score by encouraging mutual cooperation. Tit for tat can technically never win a game, score more than its opponent. It can only draw or lose. But it tends to elicit cooperation, leading to high scores for both players against the banker.
Are there real-world examples of this kind of tit-for-tat cooperation emerging?
Oh, yes. The classic example Axelrod highlighted is the let live and let live system that spontaneously developed in the trenches of World War I between opposing armies. Units developed unspoken agreements. We won't shell your breakfast time if you don't shell ours. They'd retaliate proportionally if the truce was broken, but were quick to restore peace. Predictability and ritual were key. It was pure, emergent tit-for-tat.
And vampire bats sharing blood.
Another striking example. They regurgitate blood meals to feed roostmates who failed to feed, including unrelated ones. The cost to the donor is less than the benefit to the recipient, who might starve otherwise. Crucially, bats are more likely to share with individuals who have previously shared with them. It fits the conditions for reciprocal altruism perfectly.
What's the key condition for this cooperation to work? Something about the future.
The shadow of the future. Cooperation based on reciprocity can only thrive if the game is likely to continue indefinitely. If players know when the last round is, the logic unravels. On the last round, you should defect. Knowing that, your opponent should dissect on the second to last round, and so on. Cooperation collapses. The interaction needs an unknown or infinite horizon for strategies like tit for tat to be stable.
And this applies to human life, business deals, politics.
Absolutely. Many situations are non-zero-sum games, where both sides can benefit through cooperation, rather than zero-sum where one's gain is another's loss. Understanding of the dynamics of the prisoner's dilemma helps us see why cooperation sometimes fails, but also how it can be fostered by ensuring repeated interactions, transparency, and punishing defection while rewarding cooperation.
Okay, this has been a deep dive into strategies and cooperation, but the book ends by really pushing the boundaries of what we even mean by an individual, right? With the extended phenotype.
Yes, the concept of the extended phenotype is arguably Dawkins' most significant theoretical contribution, developed more fully in a later book, but introduced in The Selfish Gene. The idea is that a gene's phenotypic affects the effects by which selection judges. It don't have to be limited to the body the gene sits in.
What does that mean, like effects outside the body?
Exactly. Think of a caddis fly larva building its protective stone case. That case is not part of the larva's body, but its structure is clearly influenced by the larva's genes. It's part of the gene's extended phenotype. A spider's web is another example. Bird nests, beaver dams. These external artifacts are products of genes, and their effectiveness influences the survival of those genes.
And it applies to manipulating other organisms too, like the cuckoo chick's gape.
Precisely. The cuckoo chick's bright red mouth is a superstimulus that exploits the foster parent's feeding response. That manipulation is an extended phenotypic effect of the cuckoo's genes acting on the foster parent's behavior. Parasites manipulating host behavior are prime examples. Flukes making snails get eaten by birds to complete the fluke's life cycle. The altered snail behavior is part of the fluke gene's extended phenotype.
And those ant cuckoo queens manipulating host workers to kill their own mother.
Chilling examples. The parasite queen's genes are expressing themselves through the actions of the host workers. It forces us to question the boundary of the individual. The relevant question becomes, whose genes are benefiting from this action, not whose body is performing the action.
So how does this help resolve the tension between the gene and the organism as the unit of selection?
It clarifies that while the gene is the fundamental replicator, the organism is typically the coherent vehicle whose survival and reproduction determines the fate of the genes inside it. Why is an individual organism a coherent vehicle, but a pack of wolves isn't? Because all the genes in an individual organism, via the bottleneck of sperm egg, share a common fate and exit route the organism's reproduction. Genes in different wolves in a pack don't share that perfectly aligned destiny.
Which leads to the final big idea, the bottlenecked life cycle. Why do complex things like us start from a single cell?
Dawkins offers three main reasons why starting each generation from a single cell, sperm egg, is so important for creating coherent vehicles. First, it ensures, back to the drawing board, genetic uniformity. Starting from one cell means, barring rare mutations, all cells in the resulting body have the same genes, fostering cooperation among them. Second, it provides an orderly timing cycle for development. The predictable sequence of cell division and differentiation from a single cell acts like a reliable clock, allowing complex developmental processes to unfold in the right order, like building an eye.
And
Third is cellular uniformity in a genetic sense, promoting cooperation. Compare a plant growing from a single spore, bottlenecked, versus one growing by just branching off broad-fronted. In the bottlenecked plant, all cells are very close relatives. A mutation in the spore is inherited by all cells. This genetic relatedness favors cooperation and suppresses cheating among cells, solidifying the organism as a unified vehicle working towards reproducing that original spore's genes.
so the bottleneck reinforces the organism as a discrete unit.
Yes, bottlenecking helps create discrete organisms, and discrete organisms, in turn, focus their efforts on getting their genes through the next bottleneck via specialized sex cells. The two things go hand in hand, reinforcing each other.
What an incredible journey through the logic of life at its most fundamental level. This detailed summarization really highlights the power of that gene's eye view.
It truly is a powerful lens. It doesn't always paint a comforting picture, but it offers deep insights into why life is the way it is.
So wrapping up this deep dive into the selfish gene, we've seen how these core concepts, the selfish gene, ESS, kin selection, reciprocal altruism, memes, the extended phenotype, can explain a staggering range of biological phenomena, from aggression to cooperation, from family dynamics to the very nature of organisms.
It's an astonishing perspective. And it leaves us, and you, with some pretty profound questions to think about. If our bodies are just temporary vehicles for potentially immortal genes, and even our culture is driven by replicating means, what does that really mean for our sense of purpose, our individuality? Can we even have genuine non-reciprocal altruism?
Yeah, how much of what we feel is our conscious purpose just programming, an illusion created by our genes and mooms to get themselves copied? And maybe the most provocative question Dawkins leaves us with. If we humans, uniquely perhaps, can understand these drives, can we actually choose to rebel against them?
As he puts it, we alone on Earth can rebel against the tyranny of the selfish replicators. For instance, by choosing contraception, consciously deciding not to reproduce, which seems to fly in the face of our entire biological programming.
That's the ultimate puzzle, isn't it? Where does our biological inheritance end and our capacity for conscious foresight and choice begin? Can we truly transcend our selfish origins?
A fascinating thought to end on, the complex dance between nature and, well, whatever makes us uniquely human.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this detailed summarization has given you plenty of new insights and maybe some challenging questions to chew on. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep being astonishingly curious.